On one cold autumn morning in 1883, a humpback whale was spotted on the east coast of Scotland within the mouth of the River Tay. Unfortunately for the whale, it was swimming just offshore the city of Dundee, which at the time was Scotland's largest whaling port. The crews of the whaling fleet were used to hunting in the waters of the Arctic, and most were returned home for the winter. The whale kept returning to Dundee despite the fleet's best efforts to catch it, until it was eventually harpooned on New Year's Eve. The whale's body was bought by showman and entrepreneur John Woods, who displayed it to the public and toured it throughout the country, earning him a small fortune. Between the whale's first sighting and its sale to John Woods, the local Dundee newspaper The Courier published 21 stories about the whale and the whaling crew's failed attempts at killing it. Against these headlines of whale sightings and hunters' exploits, one stands out. The whale interviewed by his mother on his exploits in the River Tay. This submission to the paper was a poem from one William Mcgonagle, resident of Dundee and regarded by many as the worst poet in the world. William Topaz Mcgonagle was born to a family of weavers in 1825. His family moved often in search of work, as the Industrial Revolution put many weavers out of work. The family finally settled in the quickly growing industry hub of Dundee, Scotland. The now 15-year-old Mcgonagle made Dundee his home and followed his father into the trade of weaving, which he did for much of his adult life. With little formal education from a nomadic childhood, Mcgonagle taught himself to read and thoroughly enjoyed the works of his namesake, William Shakespeare. It was said that he would often entertain his fellow shopmates by reciting entire scenes of Shakespeare whilst they worked. They enjoyed his performances so much that they once paid a local theatre to allow Mcgonagle to play Macbeth in the production of the play. Mcgonagle, though, was suspicious of his co-star playing Macduff, claiming him to be jealous of Mcgonagle's natural talent. So in the scene where Macduff murders Macbeth, Mcgonagle refused to die in the final act, leading to him also being cited as the worst ever portrayal of Macbeth. June 1877 was the turning point in Mcgonagle's life. The now 52-year-old was struggling to find work to support his family when he was overcome by an urge to become a poet. The subjects of his poem ranged wildly from his daily goings-on to current affairs to Scottish history.
Then the arrows from their bows swiftly did go, and fell amongst them as thick as flakes of snow. Then the Bruce drew his trusty blade, and in heroic language said, "Forward, my heroes, bold and true, and break the archers' ranks through and through, and charge them boldly with your swords in hand, and chase these vultures off our land, and make King Edward mourn the day he came to Bannockburn."
What is quite clear is the only thing that mattered to Mcgonagle, and perhaps the only thing he knew about poetry, was the importance of making poems rhyme. This led to him crafting some incredible and sometimes hilariously inappropriate descriptions and metaphors. Determined to make a living as a poet, Mcgonagle decided he needed a patron, and so he wrote to Queen Victoria requesting her to make him Poet Laureate. He then received a letter of rejection from a royal functionary, thanking him for his interest. Thanking him. Mcgonagle took these thanks as a royal endorsement in his work, and sought to continue. He felt a live performance to the Queen would further his notoriety, so in the summer of 1878, when the Queen was staying in her Scottish castle of Balmoral, Mcgonagle began a 60-mile expedition through mountain and moorland and a heavy thunderstorm to reach the castle.
I arrived at the lodge gates of the Palace Balmoral just as the tower clock chimed 3, and when I crossed the little bridge that spans the River Dee, which has been erected by Her Majesty.
When asked to identify himself at the gate, he announced he was the Queen's poet and presented his letter. To be told that the Queen's poet was Tennyson and he was to leave immediately and return to Dundee. On the 28th of December 1879, a violent storm hit Dundee. Estimates of wind speeds are around 80 miles an hour, and it was during this storm a train was crossing the 2-mile railway bridge that spanned the River Tay. All the signalmen at either side of the bridge could see of the train in the pitch black, were the whale oil lamps lighting the interior of the carriages, when suddenly, as one, they all went out. The bridge had collapsed. The sound of bending and snapping girders concealed by the crashing waves of the river. And from this tragedy came Mcgonagall's most infamous poem.
Beautiful railway bridge of the silvery day, alas, I am very sorry to say that 90 lives have been taken away on the last Sabbath day of 1879, which will be remembered for a very long time.
This was one of the worst rail disasters in history, the poor design of the bridge blamed for the catastrophe, as Mcgonagle reflects in his poem.
O ill-fated bridge o' the silvery tay, I now must conclude my lay by telling the world fearlessly without the least dismay that your central girders would not have given way, at least many sensible men do say, had they been supported on each side with buttresses, at least many sensible men confesses. For the stronger we our houses do build, the less chance we have of being killed.
Over the next decade, Mcgonagle continued to write, dabble and muse. He performed his poetry often to paying crowds who were enthralled by his enthusiastic and larger-than-life performances, and of course his comically terrible rhymes. The audience sometimes threw vegetables and fish at him, which only made him perform even more confidently and dramatically. These performances would often get so rowdy that Mcgonagle was banned from public performances in Dundee.
Fellow citizens of bonny Dundee, are ye aware how the magistrates have treated me? Nay, do not stare or make a fuss, when I tell you they have boycotted me from appearing in the Royal Circus, which in my opinion is a great shame, and a dishonour to the city's name.
It was also at this time that he wrote several poems about a particularly unfortunate Dundee whale, and made a number of voyages in search of recognition and his fortune. The first of these expeditions was to London, and the second to New York. He came home to Dundee from both these trips unsuccessful. On his return from New York, one of his patrons, of which at this point he had several that supported his work, suggested the publication of his works, and in 1890 the first of 2 volumes of poems were published, the collection entitled Poetic Gems. After growing tired of the lack of appreciation he received from the people of Dundee, he left to the neighbouring city of Perth. He had first expressed wishes of leaving Dundee in 1892, but as one journalist mused, he won't leave for another 2 years when he realises 1893 rhymes with Dundee. However, honours and recognition finally came Mcgonagle's way in 1894 when he received a letter from representatives of King Theobald Min of Burma, knighting him Grand Knight of the Holy Order of the White Elephant of Burma. Despite being an obvious hoax, Mcgonagle referred to himself as Sir William Topaz Mcgonagle for the rest of his days. Mcgonagle lived out his final years in Edinburgh, where he became somewhat of a cult figure. Despite this, he still died penniless in the year 1902 at the age of 77. Over his 25-year career, he wrote a total of 257 poems, all of which are still in publication a century later. I like to think of Sir William Mcgonagle as the 19th century Tommy Wiseau, a man whose lofty ambitions extended far beyond his grasp, but whose determination and good nature made it impossible not to be warmed by his character. Many writers enjoy poking fun at Mcgonagle, and it's hard not to find enjoyment in his outlandish descriptions and bizarre antics, though some critique his poems harshly, calling them simplistic and the man a buffoon for his endeavours. They point out his weak vocabulary, poor scenicisms, and how he sometimes takes very serious subject matter and makes it juvenile and comical with his poor poetic imagery. I must say, however, I disagree with comparing him too closely to other great poets of the time, for he was a working-class man with no formal training in artistic expression, who was mostly self-taught in reading and writing, putting his thoughts and feelings in verse in the hope of people enjoying them. And despite ridicule, rejection and poverty, continuing with his dream, this may not have made him a very good poet, but in my mind makes him an extraordinary example of a human being.